the data is so biased. So for instance, there's so little of the system 2 conversations going on and so much of the system 1 conversations going on that I was actually starting to think, is that perhaps the reason why AI feels to me that it has so little epistemic humility? Every once in a while, you happen to come across a topic that you happen to know and be an expert on, and you realize how stupid that conversation is. But then you turn the page in your newspaper and you come across a topic that you're not an expert on, and the tendency is for us to feel like, wow, there's so much nuance here. Little did we know that we forget about the fact that perhaps had we been an expert on the second topic, we would have judged the same way.
There's no TV show out today that is the same quality as Seinfeld in the 90s. There just isn't. We have a ton of TV shows that are like decent. Some are kind of neat, but we're not pushing hard enough on quality because we can make this quantity trade-off. The marginal return to quantity is so much higher. And so this market for curators, it's just going to be limited. I'm saying this is more of like market enshittification. We're caught in this trap where there's no point in making this kind of high quality stuff.
Think about, for instance, fake news. Why do we have so much of a problem of fake news these days? It's partly because we have this social norm, and yes, I would like to call that social norm, that we don't pay for news. Who is going to be the producer of news? It will disproportionately come from producers that have a willingness to sell close to zero. And of course, you would have that, therefore, the bots kind of news, the fake news, would inundate the market of news. And every once in a while, you have a journalist with good news there, but then you will be a needle in a haystack. The last time we had this conversation, you mentioned something about AI. Your point being that you thought that perhaps AI might be doing too little exploration, too much exploitation in order to, and doing too few wrong turns and making too few mistakes.
Or I don't know if it's AI doing that necessarily, but probably. But I think it is the human using AI is doing too little of that. I think the human without AI was doing much more exploration, and the human with AI, you sort of do this kind of superficial, I don't know, maybe I'm extrapolating from myself, but you sort of do this superficial exploration. But then if you get a roadblock thrown up, like, hey, maybe you shouldn't do this, you stop. So you don't do this, like, you don't make big mistakes. And sometimes these big mistakes turn out to not be mistakes, right? And so I don't know what the right model of discovery is, but I think that getting pretty far off the path might be how big things can happen. Now, I don't know what's happening when you just have a whole bunch of agents running around with each other, if they're doing this or not, but at least based on my use of AI and a lot of other people I talk to who are kind of using it more kind of in the chat mode as a collaborator versus as a employee, I think there's a kind of a common thread there. I don't know. I think about all the stuff that...
Can you give me an example? Give me an example about what you mean here.
Like, let's say I'm let's say I'm writing a model. And in the old days, I would set it up and then I'd start working it out. And I'd maybe spend, I don't know, 20, 30, maybe a long time trying to solve out this model. And then I'd realize, oh, my setup was screwed up in some way. So I'd tweak it, and then you have this kind of recursive engineering, right? And now I'll kind of set up a model and ask it, hey, is this gonna have a solution, let's say? And it'll tell me yes or no. And let's assume it's right. So forget about the whole issue of hallucinations. Let's assume it's right. If it says no, I'm not ever kind of pulling on that thread. So I'm not getting deep into my mistake. Whereas if I spent 45 minutes to an hour working it out and realizing why it didn't work out, I might be able to come up with a better prompt next time. And that's kind of a stylized example, but I think about a lot of the stuff that in the work that you and I have done, we've had like multi-day or multi-week mistakes, right? And we realized, oh no, we did something wrong. We have to redo a whole bunch of things. And we walked down the wrong path for, let's say, 10 days. But I think there was value to that because we learned quite a bit, and it probably made us think about things in a different sort of way. And I think the chance of that kind of thing happening now is going to diminish, like has diminished and will continue to diminish.
I do agree, but I think this is exactly the topic that we have had a conversation on last time. I think this, I don't see the difference between this and this point that Carol was making to me, that it's almost like our students are becoming less capable of learning because as they doing the learning together with AI, they're not doing as many wrong turns, and wrong turns, it
Yeah.
turns out to be very important, right? So, but I thought you mentioned another point there about AI, which we
Mhm.
actually never discussed, which you're thinking that there was a second level of issue there, which is the
Mhm.
fact that AI itself, when AI is training on data, AI itself does not do, or at least I wonder if it may not do enough hallucinations, enough mistakes to self-correct and figure out better. I think that was the point that you were trying to make there, or at
I
least,
see.
and
So that
that
would be
needs,
more when you have the agents kind of running around
yeah,
themselves.
yeah, not any interaction, or perhaps interactions of human beings with AI, but perhaps not us, like human beings from ChatGPT, from OpenAI or something like that, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
But they may not be doing as much. And I've been thinking about that. First of all, I do not know if this is a fact. I do not know how they even think about this. I do know one thing though, and I thought this would be very related to our discussion last time. I do know that whatever they have a particular data. And of course, the data could be biased. And of course, they could try to avoid biases by pulling more weight on more sparse areas of the data and putting less weight on less sparse areas of the data. The classic issue about how you reverse the biasing when you want to train your data. But the
Mhm.
concern here is that the key discussion we were having last time is exactly that the fact that the data is so biased. So, for instance, there's so little of the system two conversations going on, and so much of the system one conversations going on, that I was actually starting to think, is that perhaps the reason why AI feels to me that it has so little epistemic humility? Because when I speak to AI, like to ChatGPT is the worst for me about this. When I speak to ChatGPT, it answers me, and every once in a while, I happen to be a sort of expert on the topic. So whenever it answers me, I realize, hey, this is completely wrong.
Yeah.
But then I realize that it had answered me with full certainty, with like completely as if like as a matter of fact. And you have this kind of classic issue that you and I have talked before about this Gelman amnesia, right? that that every once in a while you happen to come across a topic that you happen to know and be an expert on, and you
Yeah.
realize how stupid that conversation is, but then you turn the page in your newspaper and you come across a topic that you're not an expert on, and the tendency is for us to feel like, wow, there's so much nuance here. But
Yeah,
little
yeah,
did we
yeah.
know that we forget about the fact that perhaps had we been an expert on the second topic, we would have judged the same way, right?
Yeah.
I'm concerned
Well,
about that.
I mean, I guess the phenomenon of like quick agreement and not really interrogating that stuff and the LLM acting with a lot of certainty or whatever. I mean, I think that's pretty well documented and talked about. So are you offering like an explanation for that? You think that this is the one potential explanation for where that emerged from? Because I don't know. I haven't seen an explanation for why that's the case. I mean, the sort of the sycophancy or whatever, that's I think it's engineered to be like that for
That's true.
marketing purposes and stuff. But this this other thing, this kind of certainty when you don't really have much basis for certainty, is that
Yes.
so this
So
is
to be clear, I do not know enough about this, but I do think that people do not quite understand how much bias there is in the data
yeah.
on pretending the world is certain and
Yeah.
pretending things are certain. And that by definition is the data that has been used to train all these
So
LLMs.
what's the alternative? Is the alternative something like you have every kind of input into the training data. Every element of the training data has some sort of certainty value associated with it, and then you have a way to aggregate those, or like how would this how would you operationalize something like this idea of nuance in there? Because you don't want to ignore stuff that people say with certainty, right? A lot of that's really valuable.
Yeah. I
Uh,
think this relates to a lot of the discussion that we had in the end of the last conversation. How would we think if our goal, for instance, is to develop nuance, or even if our goal is to get closer to the truth, whatever truth is, how does one even go about doing that? And one way that we were conjecturing could be useful would be to create an algorithm or to design an algorithm. And we could discuss the features of this algorithm, but design an algorithm that would give a megaphone to conversations during the moment where those conversations are using system 2, and lower down the volume of conversations during the moment where those conversations are under system 1. So that is, of course, that's just a way of saying things. The devil is in the specifics. And one feature that I think is not used by most people in their speech. I do not know how much it is used inside an OpenAI, inside an LLM, is the second level, right? The degree of the standard error of the statement, right? So the degree of confidence of the statement. I think the same statement. So you actually see a lot in YouTube, right? If I say Coca-Cola, some people, if I say some people like Coca-Cola and some people like Pepsi, my video is less likely to have views than if I say Coca-Cola is the best drink in the world, or if I say Pepsi-Cola is the best drink in the world. My guess is that there's going to be, in the weights that AI might give to such videos, perhaps not as much these days, but in the future, as you can learn from all kinds of bits of information, my guess is that they would put more weight on the two extreme videos than on my video, even though, at least under the current algorithm, because there are more views in those videos, and it perhaps could proxy that for consensus or some notion of consensus. Or I do not know. I think it's complicated, but if people, whenever you hear a word, a token like Coca-Cola, or Coca-Cola is good, or something like that, they might recruit more information coming from that video versus recruit information coming from my video, to pull the weight, to do this sort of like weighted average, to say what comes next after the word Coca-Cola is good, or something like that, after the expression Coca-Cola is good. I am concerned about that.
it sounds to me equivalent, and you can disagree with this, but it seems equivalent to the problem of credentialing one source versus another, right? You want to put a bigger weight on it, and that's just we have to credentialize information. And I mean, that's always been a problem before LLMs, and we came up with very elaborate social institutions to do that, universities and churches and all kinds of other systems like that, right? And I think those are reasonably successful, but I what's underlying them is there's a certain kind of cost which yields value to the signal that emerges from what some old rabbi says or what some physicist at Cambridge says or something like that, right? And there's if epsilon cost when we're talking about LLMs here, right? And so I don't, or forget about what we're talking about LLMs. We're talking about the producers of the raw data, which I guess will increasingly be LLMs, right? And so I don't, I I think that it we need a fundamentally new way of generating credentials, and I'm pretty pessimistic about our ability to do that without imposing explicit costs on the system. I think that the fact that things are costly is valuable in and of itself as a way to break down these information problems. And that's completely gone. We're just in a flood of whatever. And you could feel this with sort of the pre-AI internet as well, when you have just so much info, let's say the social media internet, where you have people basically, we reduce the cost of 1 to M conversations to basically epsilon, right? You could communicate with as many people as you want, zero marginal cost, and you end up with craziness, and you end up with less. You can. There's plenty of models here that show you end up with less information being aggregated and blah blah blah, right? What's going to happen here is it's not just that the information is going to be less aggregated, but the kind of the learning and the propagation and what you're calling this humility, that's also going to take a big hit from all this. And I think that the kind of the original sin, if you will, of social media and even the internet right before social media, I think the original sin was reducing that cost of communication to basically zero. And we have to impose a cost there. Otherwise, I don't know. I don't see a good way out of it. And
So
perhaps I was
that
just
is
saying
exactly
perhaps
what we discussed. Please
yeah.
go ahead.
I was just saying perhaps in a world where it's a whole bunch of agents interacting with each other, they're going to come up with some tax and transfer scheme to have these costs and whatnot. But I don't know.
I'm worried exactly about these kinds of issues, right? Because the moment you add a lot of cost, that usually means only certain kinds of people end up saying things, and there will be an investment for you to become an expert, for
Hmm.
you to actually have the megaphone to say something. And of course, that would mean that only certain kinds of opinions will show up in the world. And I am somewhat worried about that when it comes to objective truth, because oftentimes diversity is helpful to come up with different opinions and different options, different ways of going after the truth. It's helpful. But I am particularly worried about that when it comes to subjective truths. Like, for instance, there are lots of interesting questions that we all have that the answer for me will be very different from the answer for you. And yes, it could be understood as objective truth, like, for instance, whether what is the best thing that I should do in terms of, like, should I send my son to a particular tutoring or not? Should I send my son to play soccer or not? And I could try to understand what is the effect of that. And maybe you and I could, it's an objective truth in the sense that you could be asking the same question, should I send Greg's son to play soccer or not?
Yeah.
But you don't care nearly enough compared to me about that question. What you care
Yeah.
about, should you send your daughter to say play soccer or not? And I also don't care nearly enough compared to you. So even some forms of objective truths might appear like subjective truths in the end. And perhaps the best answer for me would be coming from what you and I would not call an expert. And perhaps the best answer for you will come from a different person who's also not an expert. Because maybe, as you know, as we discussed last time, an expert may not be that professor who has studied 20 years about this, but rather a person who's just in a very similar context as you and may have had that experience before. And for
Sure.
instance, if you look at Reddit and platforms like that, they're very well equipped to deal with these forms of truths, right? But the concern, of course, is that I wonder if the moment you open the door for all kinds of information, then you lead to the problems that we discussed last time. That's exactly what I meant last time by the idea of regurgitation, right? The fact that everybody at any moment in their time can speak about anything and then can start producing for everybody. This means that most likely a higher proportion of system one thinking is showing up in the world because people are very reactive. Everybody is, including me. Everybody is. So remember in the example that you and I were discussing last time, if there are some barriers of entry, like writing papers, all the early drafts, which may have had a higher percentage of system one thinking, never showed up and never got published. The only version that got published was the version of our papers after we trimmed down a lot of the system one thinking and we had mostly system two thinking. That's the only part that is out there. All the other parts vanished. And I do believe that's, if you are to build more nuance, we need to have a way of trimming down system one thinking, not necessarily all system one thinking, but the system one thinking that does not hold up after we do system two thinking. So that's
I'm not
what I
talking
was
about
thinking.
credentializing this. Sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I'm not talking about credentializing the source. I'm talking about credentializing the information, right? And so the way, and this is obviously imperfect, but the way we credentialize the information is through peer review, right? Which ensures that a certain amount of cost has been incurred. Hence, there's a valuable signal being revealed from there. And now there's many problems with how peer review is implemented in practice. We could spend hours talking about that. But at the end of the day, the idea behind it, the motivation behind it is, hey, if it's blind, then it's independent of the source and it's only about the content. And then we have some kind of tribunal that judges the content on the basis of whatever. And that's how it gets that kind of credential. But that's what is missing, right?
I see what you mean. The concern I have with that approach is related to exactly what you're saying as the problems of peer review, right?
Yeah.
Because part of the problem is that the moment, okay, let's just be upfront about one thing. The moment we increase the cost of something, by definition, some people will be more prone to do it, while other people are less prone to do it. So that will generate sorting, right? And there will be some form of subgroup of the population that is not going to be a random sample of the population. There will be, let's call it the quotes and quotes, peers, the elite who are going to be doing this peer review or evaluating things.
Yeah.
The problem about that is that their perspective about reality are not necessarily representative of reality itself. As you and I know, writing papers, this restricts the kinds of perspectives one can write in a paper because not necessarily all perspectives are going to be heard. Even though some of those perspectives are going to be legitimate perspectives. Now, the issue here, and I think this relates a lot to this trade-off of should we have epistemic gatekeeping, as in should we restrict how the information goes out there and becomes public? Or should we perhaps allow for the information to all go public, but then figure out a way of reweighting depending on issues like nuance, whether the information is valid in some form or way or something like that. The concern is almost there's always this error type 1 and error type 2, right? I just mentioned, for instance, one type of the error, which is when the information is actually good and it does not come through with epistemic gatekeeping. But the other option will be, of course, if you don't have epistemic gatekeeping, there is bad information that is going to go come through, which is the issue that we're talking about. So the concern, I do not know how to think about this trade-off. I think this is exactly the key trade-off. For instance, I am concerned that there are a lot of contexts where the first part, if I was thinking, for instance, in terms of statistical decision theory, I think some of this error, the first error I mentioned, the error of the bad part of epistemic gatekeeping, I think will be particularly bad when you want to learn more about health effects or other contexts where heterogeneous effects are like very intense.
Oh,
Like for
absolutely.
instance, whenever you're talking about, say, chronic pain or mental health issues, there is no way that the average is going to talk much about most people. And because of issues in statistics, but also in issues in science that we seek some form of objective metric, this goes back to our last time, right? It's going to be really hard for you to go beyond averages in an actual formal study that gets published. This leads us to be very, this leads science to underachieve from the perspective of whoever is demanding
Yeah, but
a response for their problem, right?
I don't think that letting more information out there is going to solve this problem. I think that issue is fundamentally we have to move away from empirical work. And I think if you want to make any progress, let's say you have some drug and it has highly heterogeneous effects, right? And if you want to figure out, hey, is this going to kill cancer? We need theory. We need to understand there's not enough RCTs in the world. You would need an RCT for every electron in the universe in order to get enough heterogeneity from this at a sufficient power. And I think for a lot of human problems, we have to work on theory and not empirics. If for a lot of mental health problems, why is a particular person feeling lonely? Yeah, we can give a whole bunch of means like, oh, these 12 activities are associated with being happier and blah blah blah, and we figure this out from tracing whatever 6,000 men in Boston over 90 years in the Harvard Study of Adult Development. I think, hey, which I think is one of the most important pieces of scholarship of the last century. So I don't want to poo-poo that, but in terms of how much of that's going to be of value versus why don't you go talk to your friends and ask them what you should do? Of course, I think number two is, or why don't you go talk to your parents or your teacher or your priest or your neighbor or your kid? Those are going to be way more valuable because precisely because of that heterogeneity. And when you're having those kinds of conversations, what you're trying to do basically is you're being a bit of a theorist. You're trying to build up a model of your situation as opposed to trying to generalize to everybody. I think that the idea that these kinds of problems are going to be solved by more data. So we need to get more information, more people's accounts. What you're describing, which it has a lot of appeal. Like, hey, on Reddit, you now have 1,000 different people talking about their experiences taking this drug. So you might be able to find one that matches more with your experiences, and then you can interrogate that further. I think that's ultimately you're trying to take an empirical approach and you're thinking, hey, if we have enough data, we'll be able to solve this problem. But I just don't think there's enough data. There's not enough data for you to be able to solve that problem with enough certainty that it becomes a useful new piece of input into this high quality training data set. You know what I'm saying? And so, yeah, it's almost like we got to rebuild it from the start. And maybe that's what LLMs will be able to do. They'll be able to kind of sketch out new theories or whatnot. But I'm not sure. I'm not sure that the issue is not enough data and not enough information out there. I think for a lot of problems, yeah, I don't think the issue is that there's not enough information.
So let me try to understand what you're saying, because I have some positive reaction to a lot to what you're saying and a negative reaction to one thing you're saying.
Yeah.
So I very much agree that if the two options out there are for you to look at a study, let's say I'm about to decide whether my specific kid should play video games.
Yeah.
And I have two options. I would read an RCT paper that talks about the average effect that estimates causally, and it's an RCT. It's an experiment. It estimates the average effect of watching video or playing video games on their skill. Let's say the skill is my outcome. Let's say that I care exactly about that, just to simplify. I have that option versus I go and talk to a lot of different kinds of people around me that I think makes sense, right? Mm-hmm. So I definitely believe that I would do the second thing, because I will try to match my context. I will try to match the kind of people, the kind of person my son is, the kind of video game my son is playing versus the video game that my neighbor is playing. Maybe I can get a lot more information about, because my neighbor would have a son or a daughter who's playing the exact same video game that my son is playing, when, as you know, in the RCT, the video game could be a completely different one. All those things are happening. So I get that point. Now, I also absolutely agree with you that there is a major underappreciation of modeling. And even in our field, right, of empirical econometrics, there's an underappreciation of structural work, because when we oftentimes go reducive form, the methods out there for us to go after causal effects in a way that we can trust, because they're actually causal, they often rely a lot on getting averages, and they are not very scalable towards getting us heterogeneous effects. And there are lots of problems with structural work, but one advantage of structural work is that oftentimes you can actually go after different kinds of heterogeneous effects. Of course, this is just one positive, and I did not talk about my discussion here about structural work is not representative, okay? Now,
of your beliefs about it.
Certainly not of my beliefs, yeah. But this is definitely an advantage of structural work, because it allows us to go after heterogeneous effects in a more scalable way.
And you can go outside support too, right?
And it can extrapolate, exactly. And it can extrapolate and go outside of the support where perhaps there's no data. Okay, so that is what I think. I agree about everything you said. Now, the third part, which I don't agree, is although I think it's possible, I think depending on the context, it's possible that the signal to noise ratio is sufficiently low that what you said is true, that perhaps getting more data is going to be bad. But I am not convinced that doing epistemic gatekeeping in terms of this, that restricting the data will help us. Because I do think that, and this is where AI, I think, can come in. I think AI has a way, AI is actually much better at dealing with sparse data than most other methods we think about. So if I prompt, even in a place like ChatGPT right now, I'm not saying the technology in the future, which is going to be much better, but I'm talking about right now. If I prompt correctly, saying something, hey, I have this disease that is very rare, and I am a 47-year-old man who has this disease and who is, I guess, Hispanic or other, and I'm originally from Brazil and all that, right? I can give a lot of interesting prompts. Depending on the quality of my prompt, they can actually find an answer that is much closer to what I want. And of course, if you do your prompt, of course, you're going to say, because you and I are different, you're going to say your prompt is going to be very different. And they can obtain information that's going to be very different for you. So I think perhaps one way we could think about, and again, I'm not saying that everything you said is incorrect, except for the fact that you are shutting off the alternative of those things. Like, for instance, what if really the best person out there to give me advice on my problem is, yes, it is a priest. like you said, but is a priest who lives in Myanmar. And I would never have spoken to him or her, except for the fact that perhaps he would eventually say something, and those tokens would show up for me indirectly if I do the correct prompt. You see, that is a concern for me. And again, this goes back, I still am in the same position as you, as in there is an error type 1 and error type 2 here, but I find that just restricting the data could be problematic for that reason.
Yeah, no, I think we basically are. So I'm not saying that it's bad. I guess my point is just my prior is that the marginal value of more information is fairly small. So I think those type one, I don't know if I have it right, but I think the cost of the type two errors exceed the cost of the type one errors. I think we've kind of pushed, I think we've pushed too far in one direction, and maybe we bounce back, but I think that by really underweighting gatekeeping, we we're 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 clouding the picture. Here's another example that is about as subjective as you could get. When we're talking about, like, let's say fine art, you used to have art critics, you used to have tastemakers that were talking about, hey, these are good paintings, these are bad paintings, that kind of stuff, right? And we certainly have much less of that for whatever reasons now. We also have, like, the fine art market is collapsing for new artists right now. If you're not extremely established or extremely whatever, you can't get a foothold anymore. The fine art market has really collapsed for new entrants in the last 5-ish years. And you see similar stuff with music. You see these kinds of sort of superstar economics, this like Rosen style economics coming in. You have Taylor Swift makes all the money in the world, right? It's great for her, but it's a lot harder for you to make money selling your music. You have to do it touring. Now you're selling a different kind of thing. And so we used to have these tastemakers, and these tastemakers used to be an important way to pull information that is now getting lost in this ocean of too much information. So there's this externality, given that people do have attention, and LLMs have attention too, right? We know they have context windows or whatnot. So you have this negative externality of all the information out there. And we used to have this mechanism, and it wouldn't work for everything. And we were probably missing out on some great stuff that didn't get past the gatekeeper, right? But you had these tastemakers that were bringing these things through, and you were getting new stuff. Now, what are kids today really excited to listen to? They're very excited to listen to rock bands from the 70s and 80s, right? They're like, oh, this music used to be so good, blah, blah, blah. We had it doesn't seem like there's been a dominant musical style in the last 20 years in the United States. Whereas if you heard a song circa 2000, if you heard any pop song, US pop song, I think the vast majority of people could locate it in what decade it was made and could explain certain things about it. And now there's just sort of this mishmash. I think we do lose a lot there, and there are these externalities that are to this data that I don't know. I think we're entirely on the same page about the potential mechanisms here. I just put a bigger weight on one of them, and you have a smaller weight on that one, and both of us are purely conjecturing here. So
yeah, of course. So I would say that this thing you said, even though I know very little about the art market. I don't have a brother-in-law who's an artist like you, but I do understand causality and correlation, and what you just stated is correlation, right? You stated something, and there are lots of contributing factors. And
absolutely,
one thing that is worth mentioning here as a potential contributing factor that goes in the opposite direction, as you said, is the fact that the current algorithm, let's call algorithm, right? The current algorithm values consensus, and the current algorithm does not value independence. So if a person comes along and does something that is different than Taylor Swift, that algorithm is not going to reweight and put more weight to that because it's sufficiently independent, sufficiently different from Taylor Swift. And quite the opposite. If somebody does something that is sufficiently close to Taylor Swift and does not get picked up in copyright issues, that person is going to be weighted higher, and that would lead to stable equilibrium to be a situation where the Taylor Swifts of the world get probably a lot more of the pie. So my guess is that if we were to change the reweighting system, that would involve independency of information, something almost like what you and I would think in statistics in terms of like a PCA. I wonder if the same way as more nuance would emerge, I wonder if also more different artists that just happen to be good, but they happen to have a sound that is sufficiently unique, they would be more likely to show up. I wonder that.
I would have, my assumption would have been the exact opposite, that I think that it was costlier in the past. I think I would have thought that the algorithm in the past is much more consensus driven and much less independent. I would have thought that, hey, if you're a Renaissance painter, these are the rules of painting. You can't fool around. These are the rules. And if you're doing something else, you're not painting. But there's a very powerful force where there's certain people who are endowed with these abilities, and maybe one of them's the Pope or Lorenzo de Medici or something like that, who he can say, this particular thing, I'm going to pull it up. So this guy is basically a mutation. He's able to mutate the art form and in a durable way. And so you could actually have these kinds of durable mutations, whereas now I think the algorithm is much less amenable to mutation. Even though, so you had a much, I thought you had I would have presumed you had a much stronger push for conformity, and then you have a few strong opportunities for mutation, and now you have maybe a weaker push for conformity because, hey, I can go bang on some pots and pans and upload it to Spotify and make 3,000ths of a penny every month, right? I can do that in a way that I never had an opportunity to do before, but I don't have this special guy who can pull me up from the ocean and make me the next thing. That guy doesn't exist because that guy is now an algorithm.
I think what you said is fair. So that for me is almost like a paradox because everything you said appears to be right to me, and yet everything I said before appears to be right to me. So I think one potential way to reconcile what we both said is the fact that, again, going back to your point before of low barriers of entry, because there are much lower barriers of entry to do art these days and put it out there, perhaps there are just a lot more. It's like a needle on a haystack. It's like a needle on a haystack to pick good stuff out of there, and there is cost in distinguishing the needle from the haystack, right? There's a lot of more cost there, and that becomes harder for you to pick it up. So, but I think you could have attractors that have different strengths, right? Like for instance, maybe the attractor Taylor Swift is much weaker now than the attractor Leonardo da Vinci back then.
Yeah.
Part of the reason is that the production function of distribution was so different back then versus now. Particularly because the marginal cost was so different, you had to deal with scale in a very different way. So now the only art out there would be, in this case, Bach or Leonardo da Vinci, because you had to ship it to enough places to make it worthwhile. And therefore you have to dilute the fixed cost onto sufficient number of people. And that means only very famous people will get their say, right?
Exactly. I mean, I think that the immediate, based on what I was saying, what you were saying, the immediate question is, hey, why isn't there a market for curation? Why don't we have, people should be willing to pay then for these tastemakers? And I think the issue is you're willing to pay. The reason you might be willing to pay for that is because then you get a higher quality product, right? That would be the motivation. But because you have this costless communication, we're in this quantity quality trade-off where quality is never going to be able to compete with quantity. It just can't. If I choose, hey, do I want a marginal unit of quality at some cost because I have to pay 4 cents a month or whatever, $15 a month to subscribe to this guy's newsletter who actually has great taste? Or do I want to get a little more marginal quantity where I can get like everything in the world delivered to me, right? And I have access to every show ever made on Netflix. Obviously, I'm going to take the quantity trade-off. I'm never going to take marginal quality. And so the quality of stuff sucks. This is sort of underlying this idea of enshittification. Why do TV shows suck? There's no TV show today, and I don't think I'm being I don't think I'm being nostalgic or anything, because the same is true when I ask 20-year-old college students. There's no TV show out today that is the same quality as Seinfeld in the 90s. There just isn't. We have a ton of TV shows that are like decent. Some are kind of neat, but we're not pushing hard enough on quality because we can make this quantity trade-off. Marginal value, the marginal return to quantity is so much higher. And so this market for curators, it's just going to be limited. Like demand for that's going to be fundamentally limited. And the thing is, as we continue to produce more and more, as we reduce the costs of producing a marginal unit at a marginal low quality unit, let's just say it's binary, low and high quality. So this marginal cost of low quality is going way, way, way down. We're caught in this shitty quality trap. We're caught in this enshittification trap. I'm not using enshittification in the same way that he's using it as a dynamic, how you change your product to get shitty, but I'm saying this is more of like market enshittification. We're caught in this trap where there's no point in making this kind of high quality stuff. And there's going to be some very small tail where you have the one guy who's going to be the building his sofa using like nails that he's building himself and whatnot. And he's going to sell to Elon Musk and nobody else for $6 million a sofa. Fine, you have that, but this is not going to actually reach a lot of people. And when we're talking about art and stuff and information that we want to reach a mass audience, we're going to be feeding a mass audience low quality stuff for breakfast, basically.
So here's another way of saying this, and this will lead us, I think for me, it will lead us at what I consider as of now the right diagnostic of the problem.
Yeah.
Which would eventually go to business model of companies and will eventually go to advertising. But this is another way of looking at what you're saying, right? Think about, for instance, fake news. Why do we have so much of a problem of fake news these days? It's partly because we have this social norm, and yes, I would like to call that social norm, that we don't pay for news.
Yeah.
And because we don't pay for news, our willingness to pay is essentially zero for news. Now we look from the perspective of producers. Who is going to be the producer of news? It will disproportionately come from producers that have a willingness to sell close to zero. Yeah. Imagine, for instance, if we have a willingness to pay of zero for cars. Do you think Mercedes would exist? It would not, right? There wouldn't be Ferraris in the world.
Yeah.
But we somehow feel that it's okay to pay for cars, and that's why good stuff show up. We also feel it's okay to pay for good TV shows back in the 2000s. And that's why HBO came up, start charging upfront people to pay for TV shows. And then we had Games of Thrones and TV shows like Sopranos, right? We often don't think much about that. Of course, we economists all think about that. But the moment prices go up, it informs the supply side about what to do. And if you are a particular journalist or a student who is contemplating doing journalism, and he or she needs to invest 4 years of their career on studying how to investigate a topic before, how to write properly about the topic and so on, that would lead them to have a willingness to sell that is much higher than zero for news. Yeah. And the alternative would be to have some bots that create fake news with willingness to sell close to zero. And of course, you would have that, therefore, the bots kind of news, the fake news would inundate the market of news. And every once in a while, you have a journalist with good news there, but then you will be a needle in a haystack, right? All these issues that we're talking about. Now, the problem for me, I would argue, The problem for me is the fundamental tragedy of commons that gets generated because advertising is the business model of all these companies. That essentially we're all pretending that we are not paying for our attention, but we are. Because the moment companies understand that advertising is what would drive their revenue, they, going back to our discussion last time, their KPI becomes, okay, how do I orient towards maximizing people's attention? And how do I do that? Then I will try to maximize people's attention going straight to their amygdala, not necessarily towards their system two. It's much cheaper, much more of a shortcut for us to go straight to the amygdala. I'm going to talk about fear things. I'm going to talk about things that generate no cognitive dissonance, of the type of, if you are a conservative, I'm going to get news that are conservative. If you are a Democrat, I will get news that are Democrat oriented. And I think that leads to the classic problems that we have seen, for instance, in that, what's the name of that documentary that I wouldn't say documentary, but that movie, The Social Dilemma in Netflix, right? It spoke a little bit about this idea of the issue of advertising and the fact that advertising is somehow distorting the kinds of products that show up out there. And it's not something, I would argue, and I think they would argue too, it's not something sustainable. Because as you know, like some of our PhD students are working in places like Google and Amazon, and particularly Google and Facebook, and they know a
Your
lot about
job.
econometrics, and they know a
Yeah.
lot about econometrics, and they know a lot about psychology. And our kids are in the other side, and there is a somewhat of an adversarial role they take there
Yeah.
because they want my kids' attention.
Yeah.
And that's a problem because they are very good at what they do.
Well, here's one thing I want to expand on what you said and change it. And I think it then ties the entire conversation together, which is that I don't think that there's a social norm about not being willing to pay money for news. I don't know if this is a social norm or not, but I think I would not call it a social norm. I would call it something else. But I think that there is a feeling that it is right. What is the right price for something is its marginal cost. And I think this is true of even of people who never took an economics course and don't know what the word marginal means or anything. I think that there's something innate that we believe that a reasonable price for something is its marginal cost. We have a willingness to pay whatever, but hey, anything above that, that's our service. We kind of, I think this sort of perfect competitive benchmark is deep within us. And the reason why people don't want to pay for news is because the marginal cost of news is zero. And the marginal cost of TV shows is zero. And the marginal cost of your BMW or Mercedes is not zero. So people feel totally justified. Okay, I'll pay $50,000 for this. And I know there's not $50,000 of metal and other stuff in there, but it's okay. And I think that basically what these technologies have done is they've driven the marginal cost of so many more things to zero. And because of that, why the hell should I pay for this? The marginal cost is zero. And I can even tell a much more sophisticated story. I can come with a more sophisticated story that, hey, there's probably some network externality, some demand externality. So at a marginal cost of zero, I'm making the company better off by pirating this movie, and because I might tell my friend about it, and so it's coming at no cost, and it might be increasing demand for them, and I'm getting something. So this is actually a win-win. This is some kind of price discrimination win-win going on here. I could tell myself, I could perfectly justify that story to me, and I could even write equations for it too, right? But at the end of the day, what is fundamental in I guess my telling of the world is that people don't want to pay for stuff that's zero margin cost. And you're right, people do end up paying in terms of their attention and time use and all that kind of stuff. That's less salient, but I think people don't want to spend their currency, their money on zero marginal cost stuff. And what we've done is we've made so much more stuff zero marginal cost. Even music didn't used to be zero marginal cost. I had to go buy the CD, right? Now I'm more judicious about which CDs I should buy. So now that I have to be more judicious about which CDs I have to buy, I'm going to look and see what do people say are the good CDs right now? Well, I can go to the radio and I can get this information at zero marginal cost, but I don't get to choose it. Oh, this one keeps getting played a lot. I got to get this Pearl Jam CD or whatever. Or I could go and look in Rolling Stone and see which what their reviews are for the new for new albums, and then I buy that CD. But I paid money, and there's a sense that I have this physical object here that now I can extract enjoyment from, and the marginal cost of that was not zero. And I think there's this. This is the behavioral part. I think there's sort of a discontinuity at zero. I know the cost of creating that CD was whatever, 15 cents, but it's not zero. And when I go and look at a streamed TV show or a news article or anything, in my mind, the marginal cost of that is zero point 0.0. I know that's not exactly true, but that is how I kind of internalize it. And I think we changed how we value so many things by driving that cost to zero. And now if we don't value, and basically we drove the cost of our our belief about what the cost of generating quality is, we've moved that to zero. So now why should I pay for quality? Just give me more stuff. And yeah, I don't know. I don't have a basis for it, but to me, that's the key thing is that is that's why we don't want to pay for news. That's why we don't want to pay for music. That's why we don't want to pay for all these things, even though we're unwittingly paying for it. And it didn't used to be this way. And technology is what brought these marginal costs to zero. I would pay for a
I
news.
like this. I really like this theory. It's an interesting model about how what could be happening here. The problem, of course, relates to the topic that we discussed a lot last time, right? Which is the KPIs. It turns out that people pay too much attention on certain things and not on others. And for instance, somehow a dollar is more painful to come out of my wallet than an hour of my time,
Yeah.
even though my hour is worth much more than $1.
We see this on
So
roads, pricing roads like tolls and things like that.
yeah. So yeah, I kind of like that because you could. So I think going further on this. So let's say that I accept the model, and let me go further on this, right?
Yeah.
The what would be happening here is that people, because it's so much more salient, they are so much more elastic on price. Any price change above marginal cost, people end up almost like in a corner solution problem where they just do not pay for anything above zero for those things where the marginal cost is zero. But they, of course, because of that, they end up paying a lot on their time and attention and so on, because they themselves become the product, because now the advertisers want their attention, and Facebook and Google is trying to maximize how to get your attention. Now, that by itself, I would argue, that by itself would not be a problem, just because in equilibrium, if everything I said is true, but nothing more is true, in equilibrium, after I get sufficiently tired, or after I start realizing how much I'm becoming less productive or less capable of doing things, I would expect these people will learn over time, and that these people would eventually start realizing, hey, maybe it's better to pay. Or maybe it's better to go to a different equilibrium where I don't spend any time even watching the news, or any other situation that would not lead them to watch the news at price zero, which will lead them to essentially pay attention to mostly fake news. Now, there are two concerns that for me doesn't implies that we are not in that world. The first issue, I don't think is as important, is this: we don't have enough variety of business models out there where you actually have the ability to explore, right? Not only exploit, but also explore and see, that is the benefit of actually watching good news, or that's the benefit of actually paying something. I think there are lots of particular industries where pretty much the only business model will be advertising. And that for me becomes a problem, because it's not like we even can explore. In that
You can
trade-off
get a trial
exploitation
subscription
versus.
for anything though, right? You can get a trial subscription for anything. You can explore this. You don't have to even pay for
Do
HBO.
you
You
have a
just
trial
get,
subscription for Facebook? Let's say that you
okay.
wanna hang out with your friends. You're a teenager who wants to hang out with your friends,
So that's the
and
externality
right
issue.
now most friends are in their home texting and doing things like that in a particular social media. You do not have. I mean, your son or your daughter wants to play out, but nobody wants to do that.
Yeah.
So the only way for them to socialize, at least a higher proportion of their socialization time, is going to be spent in some form of social media. But that social media does not create a system that has no business model where they charge you up front and they give you a different algorithm where you no longer have the dopamine hits coming from likes, or you may get a different algorithm that does not necessarily only agree with you. We don't have enough business model variety and diversity with respect to that, and I
Because you
think
can't
that's a
make money
major
off of
problem.
it, right? I don't think,
Exactly. So we can talk about why there is no variety of business model. Maybe because there are no profitable models out there
I mean, this is
beyond
precisely my point
the.
that the perceived marginal cost of that is zero. So the willingness to pay for most people for that is zero. That's the issue. The perceived marginal
but
cost
but
of
that but
Facebook having
that
one extra user is zero.
but not in the world that I created, right? I created the following modification of your model. I try to say, let's say that we have this elasticity problem that you
Hmm.
mentioned, but we are capable of verifying every once in a while. We realize, man, this Facebook is screwing with my life or something like that.
Yeah.
In that case, there will be eventually enough people who would demand those things. The key is this, like I said, there are two issues for me. One is the one I just said, and the second issue, which is the main one, is that those people, like those, let's say, former PhD students of ours who are working in these places, they can do both things. They can not only hijack your brain for straight to the amygdala, but they can actually make sure you don't go back to system 2 mode, and
Yeah.
or nearly enough to go back to reset yourself and to start actually demanding this particular other kind of product that would have existed in the world under a different business model.
No, but
I think that.
I agree with that second part entirely, but this, let's say you have Facebook and you have Facebook Prime, which is curated and is not trying to maximize engagement and all those other kind of stuff, right? Let's assume this exists, that somebody decided to make this.
Mhm.
What is the marginal cost of operating of a user on Facebook Prime? Zero. So how much am I willing to spend on Facebook Prime? Zero. In my model of the world where you have this super elasticity right after zero, I'm not willing to pay for this alternative. And so,
No, but you're hold. I see what you mean, but what I'm saying here is that people in reality, they work on heuristics, right?
yeah,
So what you are suggesting is that that heuristic of I don't pay anything above zero.
yeah,
Uh, and what I was suggesting is at some point they may create a different heuristic, as in, hey, I myself have a different heuristic. For instance, the heuristic I have on YouTube is I pay for YouTube Premium.
yeah,
That is essentially a heuristic that made me realize, hey, among those two options, YouTube versus YouTube Premium, I estimate that it's at least worth trying for a month to see how it worked. And it became sufficiently good for me that I estimated, hey, my willingness to pay appears to be higher than the price,
yeah.
and I will keep doing this. What I mean here is that I think it's possible that we would have been in another equilibrium world where if there were enough uh, people that were aware of all these externality problems. I don't mean externality to other people, but all these externality problem of their own brain and their own productivity that
Internalities
would be
are, yeah,
internalized, yeah,
yeah,
that would be creating because their attention is hijacked. And there would be people that stepping back towards their system two every once in a while, there will be more people willing to pay for the equivalent to a YouTube Premium. But of course, again, like I said, YouTube Premium sucks for me too, because YouTube Premium, yes, it does not have advertising, but it still have a lot of advertising in the middle of the video, which I hate. And
Hmm.
also, it has all the algorithm problems, right?
Exactly.
Which are probably, I don't think they are giving me a different algorithm because I have premium versus because I don't have a premium, right? So all these issues, they are just not enough of a complete market out there for us to purchase. And I think whenever we complain about the lack of existence of a product, it's worth it as economists to think about why those products don't exist,
Sure.
why there's not enough for that, or demand for that. And my theory right now about why there's not enough demand for that is something along the lines of what you said, but I would not call that just for sure it has to be always be true. No, that's a heuristic that people have formed, in part because I think our brains have sufficiently hijacked that people never update that heuristic towards something that might be better for them. In fact, for me, like for instance, I do not have an X account. I do not have a Twitter account because I think the path of least resistance for me was to just not be there. I think there are lots of people that end up solving their problems there that would probably have a higher demand from such a product. But of course, then it's a different problem. Like probably among those people that currently don't have X accounts or Twitter accounts, there are people like me who would probably be willing to pay for such a product as long as the product was well designed. But there are other people that would not be willing to pay for any product, right?
Yeah.
And of course, this is the problem with startups. So we don't understand this market because that market doesn't exist yet. And it's a concern.
I guess I would say two things. The first is, I mean, I definitely think these products are designed to keep you stuck and addicted and all these kinds of things. But this sort of zero marginal cost heuristic or whatever you want to call it, I think this is much more fundamental. This has been around for thousands of years. Like when you talk about when you read what people were saying about turnpikes, so the early toll roads in the 17th century in the United States and Britain, people are like, you should not be allowed to charge. This is not okay. And this idea in a lot of places over most of history, there's like taboos against charging for air and for water and for these kinds of things that are perceived when your little village is next to a river, the marginal cost of the water is zero, right? And so the idea that somebody could charge for that seems crazy, right? I think these are much more kind of anthropologically fundamental.
No, no, no. I take your point, Vikram. It's just that I would still like to call that social norms. Like for instance, you know what is also
Sure.
anthropologically,
It's a
you,
very,
you know
very,
what
very durable social norm.
you know what is something that is even more ingrained in our brains than that? The fact that we don't see infrared or ultraviolet.
Yeah,
And yet, if you ask most people, because we now appear to understand those things, I wouldn't say most people, but a lot of
yeah,
people understand this.
yeah.
We know we don't live in a flat earth. And yet, it's really hard for us to see with our own eyes that statement,
Sure.
right?
I mean,
So we can build social norms. They are more realistic. And my claim is that we're currently not building. And why? I think that's part of the reason it has to do with the technology that exists for us to get hijacked. It's a very powerful technology. It does not get regulated. And I don't even know if regulation is even the way to solve this problem here.
I mean,
I
taking the
certainly
long,
believe it does not get regulated. That's for sure. But I
yeah,
do not know whether regulation is the solution.
I mean, taking a very long view, this is just a manifestation of like, we can call it a social norm, a norm of reciprocity. And like norms of reciprocity have developed over hundreds of thousands of years, right? This is what allowed people to survive saber-toothed tigers and stuff. And this led to everything. And this is much, much more durable than this is going to be very difficult to kind of change. And I think this is something that is, to the extent that any social construct is fundamental, this is one of the things that's most fundamental. I think more fundamental than all kinds of other social things. This norm of reciprocity, where like if I give you money, you got to give me something that's worth money, and or that if I give you something that it costs something for me to get this, you have to give me something that it costs something for you to make it.
Yeah, I see what you mean.
And that is like that I think is a really, really fundamental thing in humans, and maybe it's even encoded in our genes by now. I don't know, because I this has to have been this is before language, right? This is before all agriculture, all these kinds of things. The other thing that you were saying was the what people want to do. I People are not going to want to keep doing this the more they kind of think about it, and that I completely agree with. Like I am very I think a lot of these, I think there is a bit of a backlash growing. There's certainly a backlash growing to a lot of these things. And I think social media has, I don't know if it's hit its peak yet or what, but I do think that it will be declining in prominence. I don't think this is going to be, I think we're a larger and larger segment of society is going to reject social media and go back to physical socialization, much more so. And I think that we are seeing a lot of, in terms of regulations, we're seeing some like phones in schools are on their way out. I would be shocked if in 5 years, by the time my kids are in high school, I mean, there's already phone bans in every public school in Texas and like 36 other states, right? I would be shocked that they can have phones in lots of different places. There's increasing number of bans of apps and different things for kids. And I think that there is an awakening and sort of this backlash to what this is doing. And it's very durable because like you said, there's guys on the other side that are really, really good at trying to worm this stuff into kids and adults and society and whatnot. But I don't know if we've passed the peak, but I think if not, the peak is coming close. I think there's going to be this sort of counter reformation or whatever that
Yeah.
happened.
So I'm not sure about what you just said.
Yeah,
I
it's
see your
reckless speculation.
yeah, I see your argument. I also see that it's such a hard
It's so
thing to
hard.
predict, right?
Yeah, it's so
But I
hard.
also I would argue with my very limited information set, I would argue that if I were to predict what's going to happen, it's going to be more like a whack-a-mole situation where we're going to be always behind trying to forbid certain things. If we don't solve the key issue, which is how can a higher variety of business model emerge? And to be clear, that could be the instrument of policy may not be at that level. It may be something upstream from that, right? It would be something like how can we perhaps regulate people, regulate how technology is used so that it doesn't go straight to the amygdala or something like that. I don't know. I honestly, it's such a hard question. But I would say that probably if we don't solve this actual problem, there will be a whack-a-mole situation where there's going to be the next thing
Yeah,
and
yeah,
that
yeah.
tries to solve, that tries to get our attention and something like that. And then this is going to be forbidden, and then the next thing, and so on.
Yeah.
So one thing you said before, which I thought it was kind of interesting, it made me. So you're talking about. So your claim is that this notion of reciprocity is fairly ingrained in us, and one kind of evidence for me, which is almost like an anecdotal evidence, but it corroborates your point, is if you speak to kids about the notion of fairness, you will realize that young kids have a very sophisticated understanding of fairness. It's one of the concepts where kids have the most sophisticated ideas very early on.
Yeah.
Like, for instance, you ask them about what is fair and what is not fair. I think most kids would get a very nuanced notion at age 3 or age 4, which is
Before they can even talk about it.
weird,
Well,
which
yeah.
is weird, right? weird because like I know this kid at age 4, and that kid is otherwise saying a lot of stupid things, right? But when they talk about fairness, suddenly, whoa, this is so nuanced. So I think this relates to your notion that somehow people do think about that in terms of fairness. I do think, though, that I would argue that this is also is manipulable, is can be changed. So I see, for instance, let me give you an example. For instance, in Brazil versus here,
Hmm.
in here you have places like Costco, right? They have rules like return rules that essentially you can use something and then
Yeah,
after you use for a year, you can go return and
you'll wear the
they will be
underwear and then
fine with
return
it,
it.
right? But if you look from their perspective, from their business model perspective, they are thinking about that in terms of error type 1 and error type 2, as in it's totally worth doing that because there's not going to be a critical mass of people that are going to exploit them
Yeah.
so that they will have negative profit because of it. And there will be a lot of people like me, honestly, that feel like, hey, I'm going to do this because I know they're going to be just fine if I return afterwards. So there will be essentially a higher critical mass of people that will be elastic in the positive side if they behave like
Hmm.
that versus
Yeah.
elastic on the negative side.
Yeah.
So I can guarantee you that in Brazil, they will respond positively to a business if they have this kind of return policies. But in reality, because of our social norms in Brazil, there would be a sufficiently high number of people that would use on the negative side that return policy, that would essentially misuse, that would exploit too much,
Yeah.
that it may not be profitable for the company to do that. And I do not know if it would be profitable or because it's possible that also the company itself or the CEO of the company itself may think about fairness and unfairness in ways that they don't understand this washing out perspective like the CEO of Costco would think. So it's possible that that's why most companies in Brazil are not doing that. I do not know because we don't have data on how elastic people are about that. But if I were to guess, and I think I have a little bit more anecdotal evidence that the story has to do with the demanders of the consumers because you have seen, for instance, a situation where Costco's in certain specific geographic areas that where people do a lot of that, they decide to close or they decide to change the policy. Or at least
Yeah.
that's what I heard. I don't know if it's true. So my guess is that these social norms do change. I know how it's harder for us to understand how we can change that with some how we can actively work in changing the social norm to a different equilibrium because as you know as we have worked on the way social norms evolve and there's a feedback loop process there. It's a dynamic system. It's a very complex system. It's really hard to understand that, but we can, in principle, change that. I
Yeah.
I wonder how we can even do that in that situation.
I totally agree with you. And I think that one of the things, and this maybe harping on a previous point, like the reason why we see something like this happen with a Costco is it's a it's a company that sells tangible things. So that's the only place we might have a shot. We're not going to have a shot. I don't think you're going to have a shot having these kinds of policies with selling intangible goods. It seems at odds with is what with something fundamental. And I think this is one of the pushes for intangible goods to kind of lead to a lot more customization. Because if you have a lot more customization, what you're signaling is, hey, I made this just for you. So there is some cost for you to, what is this company Cameo that you can get a celebrity to say happy birthday to you or something like that, right? Record this little video. People pay a lot of money for that. Why? Because they know, oh, this guy said happy birthday, Greg. It there was a marginal cost to that. Whereas, so I might pay to get, I don't know, Ronaldo to say happy birthday to you. I might be willing to pay some money for that, but I'm not willing to pay to get a clip of Ronaldo saying happy birthday and then I send it to you. I'm not even willing to pay a penny for that, you know? And I think that a lot of what it maybe the way to get this to work is, and but then this ties in, this is a whole different conversation, but if the way to maybe, if one way to signal that there's costs to this is extreme customization, now we run into all these other issues that we talked about with sorting and high segregation and echo chambers, and you're going to get this perfectly customized information just for you. And the problems with that in the aggregate are potentially really, really bad.
Imagine you go back to New York Times and say, "Hey, I do not like this news, so I'd like to return it."
Yeah, exactly. You can.
So
But I bet if you were a subscriber and you went back to the office with the physical paper in your hand, they'd give you $1.75 back or however much it costs now. I bet they would give you the money back for that.
so I like everything you're saying. I'm just trying to take to its logical conclusion.
Yeah.
So why would there not be a business model then? If you just take that as given, right? Why wouldn't there be a business model where companies will start advertising that they are doing a lot of research to make sure they separate the needle from the haystack, which is very costly, and they would advertise how high is this marginal cost, and for them to get exactly what they need, which is what they want, what potentially people like you and I want, which is good information. And I think this goes back to the idea that everybody's hijacked. It's like, I don't think there's enough currently. There's not enough demand for the truth. And this goes back to my previous discussion last time about part of the reason why there's no demand for truth is a good thing. It's just a corollary. It's just a conclusion, a consequence of the fact that engineers have solved a lot of problems for us. So the return of understanding science is perhaps not as high because we don't need to understand, say, quantum physics to dial a phone number and call each other. We don't need to know a lot of things now because those things are done for you. Because they're essentially the cost of not
Costs have
knowing
been paid.
has
Yeah.
gone down a lot, right?
Yeah.
This is sort of related also to this thing that I see sometimes my kids here in the United States, and this is something that I know I'm going to change the subject too, but I think it's sort of an interesting observation that's worth mentioning, maybe for another conversation. But one thing I notice about my kids is that they are, of course, we homeschool our kids, and they are not as motivated to do extremely well. And we work a lot with figuring out how to get that. But then I remember sometimes how I grew up, right? I grew up in Brazil where my parents are middle class, but I could see the counterfactual of if I don't work hard, I can see the life that my neighbor lives. And that life is not very good, at least from my perspective at that time. So I could see this counterfactual world. Honestly, my kids around where I live, they cannot see that. They really can't. And I think that probably is part of the reason why because I mean, come on. Well, yes, some people have a lot of inherent work ethic, but this obvious observation I just told you that I did observe made me work harder in my life
Huge incentive.
because I could easily see this. I could easily make this mental model because both my parents work hard. They had a lot of work ethics, and I lived a good life, a particularly good life relative to some people around me. And of course, I didn't know nearly enough about the life that these other people live. I did know that they had less education than my parents. That was obvious to me. That was fairly salient to me. So it makes me, as a Bayesian person that perhaps one might tend to be, we might realizing, hey, maybe I should have this marker called education. Maybe I should go and be a good student and things like that. I don't
You're
see
being a theorist. You're being a theorist.
exactly, but I do not see any scope for my kid to learn in that direction around here. So I have a PhD, my wife has a PhD, all my neighbors living near me, not all, some of them do have PhD, but most of my neighbors, they don't. Most of my neighbors probably work less than I do, and my wife does, because we're kind of nerds. We like to work, and they have a good life. They have their own music band. They have a nice life. My kids see that, and they do not necessarily build this mental model that doing what my dad does gets me any different outcome than doing what my neighbor's dad does.
Yeah.
And I don't even know if this is bad, because the fact is, it is a reality that the returns to schooling in the United States are lower than the returns to schooling in Brazil. It's true. So I don't even know if this is bad, but what I'm saying is that I am, as a parent who values a lot of education and values work ethic, a lot more than education, actually, I find it difficult to instill on my kid that, because reality is knocking at the door for them.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's interesting.
Yeah.
Maybe that could be a different conversation, but I learned a lot today.
Yeah, no, this was good.
That was cool.
This
Okay.
is good. All right.